Good morning, genealogy friends. Happy Thursday. So I'm talking about using timelines in genealogy today. And I think this one, I think this one ought to be pretty interesting. I did one on using charts to compare different kinds of data, especially census data, a while back. And I know that you guys liked that. Or I guess technically we used a table, but I tend to mix up the words chart and table, as you will see, as I teach today. Good morning. So I did add one more page to the shop, and it's there now, and I'm going to show you how to use it. I do want to stress that I didn't actually plan on adding this page in, but I went ahead and put it up because I use it. I just think it's a little bit complicated, and well, I'll explain it, but don't feel like you have to use this specific page. The thing about using timelines is that all timelines are making, it's a way to make history visual, so you can do it in any format that works for you. But I'm going to show you 3 different examples. Good morning. So I don't have any business other than that to share this morning. I am talking about what's going on with the course in the book, but I'm talking about that tomorrow. So I do know we've had a lot of new members. Hello, new members. To the genealogy group. And I think people are adding, they're liking the page. I don't get that notification when people join the page, but if you're new around here, welcome. This is a really good community. The group is a really good group. Everybody in there is smarter than I am, and that's awesome. So if you're feeling a little lost, I was a little worried about doing something. This isn't complicated, but I am showing you 3 different kinds of timelines, and it sort of assumes that you're in the middle of your genealogy research if you're building timelines. If you're not there yet, don't let this overwhelm you. There are lots of videos that I've done before that should help you. If you have questions, get into the genealogy, the Family Tree Notebooks genealogy group and ask questions. People in there are very nice. If you've tried to get into the group and I haven't approved you, it's because you didn't answer the membership questions, or you might be one of the 3 people, I think, in history that have answered the membership question, do you promise to be kind, with no, in which case, that's why you're not in the group. I don't know. It's one of those things where I think, did they read that wrong? I wish that there was a reply button so I could be like, are you sure? Are you sure you don't promise to be kind? It's one thing to just come in there and then accidentally not be kind, but that's a weird thing to not promise out of the gate. Okay, let's talk about timelines. So we are going to look at my husband's great-grandfather, John Edward Queen. You guys might remember him from the tour that I did of this notebook. So John Edward Queen lived from 1881 to 1949. I have his chapter, has a lot of different things in it. Here's one of those tables that you can see I was comparing censuses. He was married twice, had a bunch of children, and lived and died in one location. I am going to show you 3 different ways to use a timeline to get a visual handle on John Edward Queen's life. So let me move my notebook out of the way. Okay, so the first timeline, we're going all the way back to elementary school, middle school history projects here. This is just a timeline that I wrote out in ink. You can use these kinds of timelines, really traditional timelines, to do things like compare your family's or one ancestor's life events to historical events. You can see down here on this timeline, I have the dates for World War I and World War II and the Great Depression. You can use it to compare 2 or 3 different people if you're trying to figure out how people were moving around. You can sometimes use it to compare people that have the same name and figure out, okay, which records go with which person. In this one, I compared the lives of John Queen with his 2 wives. So the purple is his wife, Amanda. The orange is John, and then the green is his wife, Evelina. Now, there are a number of events that affected more than one person here. For example, these orange ones up here, these are John and Amanda's children and John and Amanda's marriage. And so you can see it in the little dots. I have an orange dot for John's events, but then I circled it in purple to say that it also affected Amanda. And here you can see Amanda dies. I don't have marriage information for John and Evelina, but 2 years later, their daughter is born. You can see those dots are orange with the green circle because Evelina's information is in green. And then I have Evelina's death here after John's death. Now again, this is just to get a visual handle on what was going on, how fast were things going on. I mean, it's very impressive how many children the man had, you know, in this middle part of his life. Anecdotally, it's interesting that, you know, within a year of his second wife being born, his first wife is marrying someone else, just to show you, you know, ages and what everybody was doing. These can be really, really helpful. This is sort of an exercise that I do when I'm trying to figure things out. I don't often keep timelines like this in my book, just because once I figured out whatever I'm trying to figure out, it doesn't usually serve me to hang on to them. But you could definitely do this in one of the blank notes pages. And, you know, if I completed this and I thought it was handy, I could also scan this as a document, shrink it down, put it on a blank notes page really easily, and keep it in somebody's chapter if I thought that that was helpful, or if I wanted to write it out, but I wanted to put it in Evelina and Amanda and John's information. Although Evelina doesn't have a chapter in my notebook because she's not a direct ancestor. My husband is a descendant of Amanda and John. So Amanda and John have chapters. Okay, so that's a very traditional timeline. Let's look at this timeline page, which you guys should be familiar with. So this is just the timeline page. This page is available for sale as a single page. And, you know, after yesterday's update, when you buy the timeline page for $2, you get, okay, let me pull this one out for a second. You get left-hand and right-handed pages. So you can see there's 2 pages, but they're both the timeline page. You get both of these pages in all 24 colors for $2. But if you have purchased a deluxe bundle, either the US or the international, you're going to have the timeline page in there. So don't rush out and grab it if, you know, it's possible that you have it and you've just never used it, is what I'm saying. But if you want it in all the different colors and you want it in the low ink or something, then you might want to get it. Okay, so this is the timeline page series that I made for John Queen. Now, the timeline page has places for the age, year, and location and the event. I make timelines for my ancestors using their birth and death dates, and I just go in and do 1 line per year. Now, you don't have to do it this way. You might have somebody who has multiple events in the same year, and you also might not want to have these blank spaces on the timeline if not a lot was happening in the first however many years of that person's life. I like to do it this way because, again, it helps me visualize where everything was happening in this person's life in sort of an even manner, but that's a preference thing. So you can see I have nothing until he's 19 years old, which is when he's recorded in the 1900 census, is living in Gilmore, West Virginia. By the way, 99% of this man's life events happen in Gilmore, West Virginia. I actually thought as I was going through that I should have shared somebody who moved around more because it might have been a little more interesting. But I think that including the location is important because that can help you see inconsistencies and gaps. If you have everything in Gilmore, West Virginia, and then all of a sudden you've got something in a new city, that might be a flag that that record doesn't fit. Now, he does do something in a different city, but we'll get to that. Okay, so you've got his census residence being recorded in Gilmer. 3 years later, he's marrying Amanda. Then we've got the birth of his daughter, birth of a daughter. By the way, these are from birth certificates for his daughters that I'm getting this location. It's up to you. Now, here's the interesting thing. The fact that the daughter was born in that location doesn't necessarily mean that he is in that location. I happen to know that he was there because the man basically didn't go anywhere. But that might be something to keep in mind. Just because somebody's child is born in a certain place, if you're looking at the father of the child might not necessarily be in that place when that child is born. Just a reminder. Here we've got the death of his wife Amanda, more births. I included the death of his father because he's included in probate information. And then, more children. Not a ton on this person's timeline. I could fill this in. I will fill this in as I continue to do research on him. But this is a reasonably empty timeline. But you can see that in just 3 pages, I've captured 68 years of his life in a really even way. So I just find that very satisfying. And again, it's a good way to proof for gaps and things that I've done wrong. Now let me show you the last timeline version. And this is the new page if you wanted it. But again, I want to stress that this is something that you could do if you make your own chart or just scribble it out on paper. This timeline chart is, timeline chart, timeline table. This is to organize the evidence that you've collected for somebody into a chronological linear series. So I have dates starting from the beginning of his life and going on. I will say this page is easier to use if you're using something like GoodNotes 5 where you can easily move things around. Because if I had a new piece of information, I could use the lasso tool to just scoot everything down. Other programs, you can do similar things, but I'm just saying if you're doing it by hand, that might get a little frustrating. But here I've taken different pieces of evidence. So his first evidence, I've got him listed in the West Virginia Births Index on Ancestry.com. So I have the date of his birth. I have the location. Now these boxes are things that I use to sort of make sure that I'm also tracking how much weight I want to give this evidence. So just a little refresher. We've talked about primary and secondary sources. Primary sources are sources that were right there, witnessing something happened, and the source is recorded. The piece of evidence is created very close to the time that the event took place. Secondary is like if somebody is remembering when somebody was born 30 years later, that's a secondary source. Original and derivative, I can't remember if we've talked about this. It's really simple though. Original records are records, there's like a birth certificate that somebody writes in and then that's a birth certificate. That's an original record. An index of that lists that birth certificate is a derivative. It's just, one step away. So if somebody's copied something, if they've added it to an index, things like that, that's a derivative. Now, photocopies are still considered original records or like photocopies of an original record are originals because the photocopier probably isn't going to change the information unless the copy settings are terrible and you now can't really read it. The whole idea about the difference between original and derivative, every single time a human gets involved copying things into an index, etc., that you just increase the chance that person might have made a mistake. And so there could be more errors in a derivative record. And when you have a secondary versus a primary, that person's remembering something that they weren't there to witness, or they're reporting information that they know from hearsay, not because they were there. You increase the chance of mistake. So original primary records are the best pieces of evidence. Derivative and secondary, you've increased the chance that there's an error in that record. But again, original primary records can still have errors, just as a reminder. Anyway, I like to keep track of this because if there's an inconsistency and it's coming from a secondary derivative record, I might think to myself, okay, I wonder if that's just a copying error that happened. So I have notes, I have where this piece of evidence is from. Down here is a census record. Census records are original. If you're looking at a photocopy or a scan of the census record, that's an original and a primary record. Now, people get confused about whether or not census records are primary and secondary. Sorry to get all nerdy, but I feel like this is important. Census records are considered primary records, even though a census taker might have gotten the information from a house guest, from an older child. In some cases, they might have gotten it from the neighbor. So you might be getting information from somebody who doesn't necessarily have the best answers. So again, you can have census errors, but it's considered a primary record because that is that person's immediate best information about what's going on right then. Because the census is about the state of the family on that day. That person's recording that at that time. That's a primary record. And again, even though you have a photocopy or a scan of the census, the photocopier or the scanner didn't change the information. So that's an original primary record. That shows that he's single, he's a farmer, he's living in Gilmer, West Virginia. Down here, 5 years later, we've got his marriage, and I'm getting that from the Ancestry.com West Virginia Marriages Index, not from the original marriage record. So this is primary information because I'm assuming that the index took that information from the marriage certificate, the marriage record, but it's derivative because all I have is the index. Here we have a record where it's his wife Amanda's death certificate. So it's an original primary record, but all of a sudden the location changes to Pitcairn, Pennsylvania. But John himself is the informant, and on his death certificate, on her death certificate, he lists his residence as Pitcairn, Pennsylvania. Which again, you might think, well, that's strange for somebody who was in Gilmer, West Virginia for his whole life. Background on that, she's from Pennsylvania. Her family was in Pennsylvania, and it says on the death certificate that she had tuberculosis for 200 days. So most likely she went to Pennsylvania to try to get better, or because she was dying and she wanted to die where she was from. So the fact that that's an inconsistent residence, it makes sense in the context. That's why all those notes are there. Here we've got his 1920 census, which unfortunately, I hate when they gave a date range for the censuses. Just pick a day. Original primary. He's still a farmer, and at this point he's married to Evelina. I don't have their marriage certificate, like I mentioned, so this is the next chronological record that I added. If I was to find it, I would just scoot these down using GoodNotes and then put that in there. I didn't include the birth indexes and things like that for his children on this chart. 1930 census, which for some reason didn't include the month. I don't know what they were doing in West Virginia. He's a farmer working on his own account, still married to Evelina. So we go to the second page. This is just continuing the chronological records. We've jumped up to the 1940 census, still married to Evelina. Now he's working as a saw cutter, which if he wasn't from Gilmer, West Virginia, which didn't have a whole lot of people, then I might be worried about the fact that he's been a farmer up until now and all of a sudden he's a saw cutter. And why would he have switched jobs so late in life? But in 1942, we have his World War II draft registration card, another original primary record, where he says that he's employed by Turner Brothers in Glenville, West Virginia. A little bit of research into that reveals that it makes sense that he was working as a saw cutter for them. For whatever reason, he's no longer a farmer. So this, chronologically putting these together, noting that there's less than 2 years between these records, these support each other. And so this stops me from thinking that I might have the wrong John Queen, even though I wasn't worried about that in this instance. That's an example of something that could help you with another record. And then finally we have his burial, and this record is the headstone from Find a Grave. Now there's actually a little bit of debate about this. I fall into the camp of thinking that headstones are original primary records because the headstone, even though it's not necessarily the headstone's not being created right after the person dies, the chance that that information is getting lost in between when the headstone shows up in the burial, it's pretty accurate for death information. Now, if I was using headstone from Find a Grave over here to record his birth, I would have put that as secondary, because a headstone as birth information is much more likely to be hearsay, to not be provided by somebody who was there when that person was born. But for death information, I think of headstones as a primary record. And again, this is not Find a Grave, a photo of the headstone. That's not a derivative record because I can see the original. If I only can see, the indexed information that somebody puts in and not necessarily a photo of the headstone, then I might consider that a derivative. Because again, I'm not looking directly at the record, in which case this record is a headstone. So That is the timeline chart page. Again, if you're interested in this specific page, this is another $2 single page purchase. You get these 2 pages, left hand, right hand, and you get them in all 24 colors, and they're in both shops. But you can see that you can make your own table depending on how the information makes sense for you. But hopefully that wasn't too much. The thing about timelines is that, like I said, they help you visualize history. You can check for gaps and inconsistencies. But tracking a person through time, adding in historical events, comparing 2 people's timelines, even if you're not doing it for the nerdy research reasons, so that you can double check your work, or so that you can try to fill in the timeline so that you have records for that person's whole life, it really, for me anyways, it really humanizes my ancestors to write things out like that, because when you don't have records between the ages of 6 and 18, let's say that there's a giant gap there, writing things out like, oh, when he was 8, it was 1900. When he was 12, it was 1904. It's very, I don't know, it really just puts them in time in your mind as you're going through that. You can also use timelines to double check somebody else's work. If somebody's put together a family history, things like that, and it doesn't, sometimes it helps if you're, one of the people that's inheriting those gigantic typed out on a typewriter carbon copies of some family history that somebody wrote 50 years ago. It can help to go through that and make a timeline of everything that they're saying, because every now and then you're like, wait a second, if this was true, then this person had a baby when she was 71. That seems wrong. So, yeah, I don't think I have anything else to share on timelines. I can see that I got comments. I'll have to go back and answer them. But if you had any questions about that, let me know. And again, just if you search the shops for timelines, both of those listings are going to come up. But if you have a deluxe bundle, then you have that original timeline page, the one that I just write the year and the age for all of my ancestors. So I think they're really helpful. All right, I'll be back on tomorrow to talk about what's going on with the course and my book and how the year is going to look for family tree notebooks. So, all right, thank you guys for being here, and I'll see you tomorrow.